Let me paint you a picture. It's 1979. Susie Sue walks onto a stage in London in black lipstick, hair spiked and dyed, eyes ringed in dark kohl, wearing clothes that the mainstream fashion world would not have touched with a 10-foot pole. She's performing Jigsaw feeling. The audience looks like her. Black clothes, pale faces, jewelry made to unsettle rather than impress. A collective aesthetic statement that says to the world outside, we are not you. We don't want to be you. We refuse to perform your normalcy, and we will not apologize for any of it. The goth subculture that crystallized in that moment out of post-punk Britain, out of the Batcave Club and Bauhaus and Joy Division and Susie and the Banshees and The Cure, was built on a foundation that can be stated simply. The mainstream is comfortable, conformist, and dishonest. It tells you how to look, how to think, what to feel, what to celebrate, and what to fear. The goth response to that mainstream was to reject it completely, not with the confrontational aggression of punk, not with the utopian optimism of hippie culture, but with something more permanent and more personal. A decision to inhabit the darkness the mainstream pretended did not exist, to find beauty in what the comfortable world called ugly, to think independently even when, especially when, independent thought made you unwelcome in the spaces where everybody else seemed perfectly content. That is the tradition. That is the inheritance. That is what the black clothes and the dark music and the literary obsession and the aesthetic individualism were always pointing toward. The free individual standing apart from the herd, refusing to be managed by institutions that mistake conformity for virtue and popularity for truth. And then the left came along and said, we stand for the marginalized. We stand for the different. We stand for the people the mainstream rejects. Join us. And a significant portion of the goth community said, okay. And the left said, great. Now, here is what you're allowed to think. Here's what you're allowed to say. Here is who you're allowed to support. Here is what words you cannot use. Here is what opinions will get you canceled. Here is what art you should not make. Here's what music platforms should deplatform. Here's what ideas are too dangerous to express. Here's what jokes are violence. Here is what speech is harm. Comply or we'll destroy your reputation, your livelihood, and your community standing. Susie Sue is turning in her metaphorical grave. She's not dead, but she might be when she sees what became of the movement she helped build. Tonight, I'm going to talk about why you can't be a genuine practitioner of goth culture, of the tradition of radical individualism, aesthetic defiance, intellectual independence, and rejection of mainstream conformity that goth represents at its best, and simultaneously be a foot soldier for the most conformist, most controlling, most ideological, totalitarian political movement in contemporary American life. The contradiction is not subtle. It's absolute. And the people who are living it are not rebels. They are the most thoroughly captured conformist in the country, wearing the costume of rebellion while doing exactly what they're told.
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to awaken America.
Before the argument can be made, the tradition has to be honored, because the point of this episode is not to attack goth culture. It is to defend it. To defend what it actually is against. The people who have wrapped themselves in its aesthetic while abandoning everything it stood for. Goth did not emerge from a political manifesto. It emerged from music, from the post-punk British scene of the late 1970s that looked at punk's raw aggression and asked, what comes after the explosion? Punk said, destroy the establishment. Goth said, the establishment is only one of the things worth being afraid of. There's something darker, older, more permanent than the political order of any given moment. And it lives in the spaces that comfortable people refuse to look at. Death, grief, the shadow side of human experience that mainstream culture has always wanted to pretend away. The romantic tradition in literature, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Poe, had been pointing at those spaces for a century before the first drop of black hair dye hit the Batcave bathroom sink. Goth picked up that thread and ran it through electric guitars and synthesizers and a fashion aesthetic that said, we're not afraid of the dark. We live here. Bauhaus opened the door with Bela Lugosi's Dead in 1979. 9 minutes of droning bass and echoing vocals that referenced the original Dracula and said, simply, that the romantic darkness of the Gothic literary tradition was available to the present moment, that horror and beauty were not opposites, but companions. Joy Division, Ian Curtis, Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, Stephen Morris, produced music out of Manchester's post-industrial bleakness that mapped the interior landscape of alienation, depression, and the sense that the bright optimism the mainstream demanded was a lie that honest people could not sustain. Curtis's lyrics were not political in the partisan sense. They were personal in the deepest sense. The record of an interior life that refused to perform happiness it did not feel, that refused to pretend the darkness was not real, that insisted on honesty about human experience even when that honesty was uncomfortable and unwelcome. Susie Sue brought something else, defiance as an aesthetic. The black makeup, the provocative clothing, the deliberate inversion of mainstream beauty standards. These were not fashion choices in the ordinary sense. They were statements. The statement was, I will define my own appearance, my own identity, my own relationship to beauty and darkness and femininity. And I will not apologize for it, and I will not change it because you find it unsettling. That is individualism. That is the refusal to be managed by external social pressure. That is precisely what goth culture, at its best, has always been about. Robert Smith of The Cure added the literary dimension, the Gothic novel's preoccupation with atmosphere, with the relationship between interior emotional states and exterior environments, with the haunted house as a metaphor for the haunted mind. Peter Murphy of the Bauhaus, Andrew Eldritch of the Sisters of Mercy, Rosanda Thomas of the Christian Death Project in America, all of them were building something that was simultaneously artistic, intellectual, and deeply personal. This was not a mass market product. It was a subculture in the original scene, a culture beneath the dominant culture, operating by its own values, its own aesthetics, its own definition of what was beautiful and meaningful and worth caring about. The punk parallel is worth establishing here because punk is the adjacent tradition that goth emerged from and is often confused with. Sid Vicious and the Sex Pistols, the icons of punk's most extreme expression, were not goth. Punk was confrontational, where goth was atmospheric. Punk was political in a raw, immediate, burn-it-down sense, where goth was personal in a literary, interior, this is what it actually feels like to be human sense. But they shared the foundational commitment: reject the mainstream's terms, refuse to perform the happiness and conformity and normalcy it demands, and say out loud what the comfortable world wants you to keep quiet. Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, who, unlike Vicious, is still alive and very much vocal, voted for Donald Trump. He has spoken extensively about why. About his contempt for the ideological conformity of the British and American left, about his views that the working class has been abandoned by a progressive movement that cares more about its own cultural signaling than about the people it claims to represent, about his belief that the media establishment is the new mainstream that anyone with genuine countercultural instincts should be opposing. Whether you agree with his politics or not, the logic he is applying is the logic of his own tradition. Identify the establishment, reject its terms, refuse to perform the compliance it demands. That is the tradition. That is what goth culture, at its best, has always been. The principled, aesthetic, personal, and intellectual refusal to be managed by the mainstream. Now let's talk about what the left has become and why anyone who actually lives by that tradition should find it the most suffocating environment imaginable. The left that exists in America in 2026 is not the left of the 1960s counterculture. It is not the left of free speech absolutism that produced the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964, when Mario Savio stood on the steps of Sproul Hall and said that if the machine is odious enough, you have to put your bodies on the gears. The left understood that free expression, the right to say unpopular things in public spaces without institutional retaliation, was the foundational freedom, the one without which all others were theoretical. That left was actually counterculture, actually in opposition to the institutional powers that controlled access to platforms, publications, and public life. The contemporary left is those institutional powers. It controls the universities. It controls the major media organizations. It controls the corporate HR departments that determine what is acceptable to say in professional settings. It controls the social media content moderation systems that decide what speech is permitted on the platforms where the majority of public discourse now occurs. It controls the entertainment industry, as I discussed in my Hollywood episode, and it uses that control to determine what stories get told and what values get reinforced through the most powerful cultural influence system ever built. It controls the public school curriculum infrastructure, the teacher certification programs, the administrative frameworks that govern what children are taught in government-run schools from the age of 5 through 18. The contemporary American left is not the opposition to the establishment. It is the establishment. And like all establishments, it uses its institutional power to enforce conformity. The enforcement mechanisms are specific and they're ruthless. Cancel culture, the coordinated, organized destruction of a person's professional and social standing for expression or expressing an opinion that the ideological consensus has decided is unacceptable, is the primary tool. It operates through social media pylons that begin with a screenshot of an offending statement, amplified through activist networks with millions of followers, escalated to employers, clients, publishers, and professional associations through organized pressure campaigns, and concluded with the removal of the target from whatever institutional affiliations and income sources made them visible in the first place. The target does not have to have done anything illegal. They do not have to have harmed anybody. They have to have said something, in some cases something that they said years ago in a different cultural movement without any harmful intent that the current ideological consensus regards as unacceptable. The list of things that could trigger this process is long and expands constantly. Expressing the view that biological sex is real and binary, questioning the efficiency of specific policy proposals, using a word that has been reclassified since the last time you used it, associating professionally or personally with someone who has been canceled, liking the wrong post, failing to post the right statement during the right news cycle. The rules are not written down in a stable, accessible form. They evolve continuously, enforced by a distributed network of ideological monitors whose primary purpose is finding violations, and the only way to stay safe is to perform constant, visible compliance with whatever the current moment's consensus requires. This is conformity. This is the mechanism of conformity in its most modern and most efficient form. Not the slow social pressure of traditional community norms, not the legal enforcement of authoritarian states, but the instantaneous networked reputation destroying machinery of a progressive institutional culture that has decided that the free expression of heterodox views is harm rather than speech, that disagreement is violence rather than dialogue, that the only acceptable response to an opinion it dislikes is the destruction of the person who expressed it. The free speech dimensions of this are not abstract. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression documents campus speech restrictions, deplatforming of speakers, and formal university speech codes that prohibit expression the left finds offensive. The ACLU, which built its entire institutional identity on defending free speech for everyone, regardless of the content of their speech, has shifted its position under progressive institutional pressure to support restrictions on speech that causes harm, with harm defined by the ideological consensus rather than by any neutral legal standard. The social media platforms that deplatformed a sitting president of the United States before he was a sitting president again did so under the same institutional pressure from the same progressive cultural establishment. The Overton window of acceptable expression in contemporary America progressive culture is narrower than it has been at any point in the past 50 years. Now, ask yourself, what would Robert Smith make of a cultural movement that decides which words are too dangerous to speak? What would Susie Sue make of an ideological community that demands visible performative compliance with its ever-shifting consensus as the price of social belonging? What would Ian Curtis, who wrote about alienation from the conformist social world with the precision of a man who felt it in his bones, make of a political movement that enforces ideological uniformity through the threat of social destruction? The answer is not ambiguous. The Goth tradition was built in specific opposition to exactly this kind of conformist pressure. The aesthetic was always the statement: I refuse your terms. I will not perform your normalcy. I will not change myself to make you comfortable. The left in 2026 requires exactly the performance that tradition was built to refuse. The Goth artistic tradition has always gone to places the mainstream found disturbing. That was the point. Death, decay, darkness, the shadow side of human experience, the Gothic literary tradition's obsession with horror and the uncanny. These are not comfortable subjects. The mainstream has always wanted to manage them, to contain them, to ensure that the art produced about them carries the appropriate warnings, the appropriate distance, the appropriate reassurances that the darkness is not real, or is safely fictional, or is being condemned rather than explored. The Goth tradition refused that management. It insisted on the right to sit inside the darkness without explaining itself, without apologizing, without tagging a content warning onto the experience of honest artistic engagement with the full spectrum of human reality. The contemporary left has built the most comprehensive content moderation and speech restriction infrastructure in the history of American culture. And it has done so while insisting that what it is building is not censorship. The semantic distinction: it is not censorship if a private company does it. It's not censorship if the platform makes the decision voluntarily. It's not censorship if the community holds the person accountable for what they said. Is the most important ideological move the left has made in the past decade. By defining censorship exclusively as government restriction of speech, it has given itself permission to destroy careers, deplatform voices, and enforce ideological conformity through institutional and social mechanisms while claiming, with a straight face, that it supports free expression. The music streaming platforms that have removed artists for statements made outside their music are doing something that the Goth tradition, the tradition that produced music about death and darkness and human depravity and the Gothic underbelly of existence, should find existentially threatening. The argument that music can be removed from public access not because of what the music contains, but because of what the artist said in an interview, posted on social media, or expressed in a political opinion, is an argument that subordinates artistic expression to ideological compliance. Under that framework, a goth artist who explores dark themes in their music but holds conservative political views is not a dark artist. They are an ideological deviant whose art can be held hostage to their political compliance. The visual art world, which has historically been one of the most permissive spaces for the exploration of dark, transgressive, and unsettling imagery, has been subjected to the same progressive conformity enforcement. Exhibitions have been canceled because an artist expressed a view the institutional left found unacceptable. Grants have been denied because arts councils have embedded progressive ideological requirements into their funding criteria. The argument that art institutions should reflect and promote the values of their communities has been converted under progressive institutional governance into an argument that arts funding should be conditioned on ideological conformity with whatever the current progressive consensus requires. The Gothic literary tradition that gave goth culture its name and its intellectual foundation has always celebrated the transgressive, the macabre, the morally ambiguous, and the ideologically uncomfortable. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is not a comfortable story about responsible science. It's a story about creation, about the creature that exceeds the creator's control, about moral responsibility in the face of something the creator did not fully anticipate. Bram Stoker's Dracula is not a simple horror story. It's an exploration of sexuality, of infection, of the fear of the foreign and the erotic and the consuming. Edgar Allan Poe's work is saturated with madness, obsession, guilt, and the complete dissolution of rational self-control. None of these works would survive the contemporary progressive content review process without significant modification. None of them would receive Arts Council funding in an institution that has embedded progressive values into its grant criteria. The tradition that Gothic culture claims as its intellectual inheritance is the tradition that the contemporary left's cultural institutions would find most troubling. And they would find it most troubling precisely because it refuses to perform the moral and ideological clarity that the progressive culture demands of its art. The goth who genuinely inhabits this tradition, who reads Poe and listens to Bauhaus and wears the aesthetic as a statement of individualism and refuses the mainstream terms, should look at the contemporary progressive cultural establishment and see the enemy, not a political enemy in the partisan sense, an enemy of the artistic and intellectual freedom that the goth tradition has always been about. Let's talk about something more concrete than ideology. Let's talk about what the progressive political project actually costs the people who belong to it. In money, in freedom, in the right to direct their own lives according to their own values, and why those costs are particularly visible from the perspective of a subculture that has always prized self-determination over institutional belonging. The progressive economic agenda is not complicated. It involves a systematic transfer of resources from people who earn them to programs, populations, and institutional structures that the progressive governing class has decided are more deserving of them. This transfer operates through taxation, through regulatory compliance costs, through the inflationary pressure of monetary policy that erodes the purchasing power of wages, and through the specific allocation of public resources to programs whose primary beneficiaries are the constituent communities of the progressive political coalition. The working class Goth who earns a paycheck doing something unglamorous to fund the aesthetic life and the music collection and the independent existence that Goth culture celebrates. That person is paying for all of it. The open border policy that allowed 8 million people to enter this country without adequate vetting is not a costless abstraction. It is a fiscal reality that competes with the public resources available for everything else, including the communities where working class people of every subculture live and the services that they depend on. The dependency culture that the Progressive Project has built and maintains, the systematic expansion of government benefit programs that create long-term reliance on public support, rather than building the individual capacity and self-determination that genuine independence requires, is antithetical to Goth tradition of self-sufficiency and nonconformity. The Goth ethos has always been about building your own world outside the mainstream on your terms, finding your own beauty in what the comfortable world discards, sustaining an interior and aesthetic life that does not require the mainstream's approval or its resources. That is a self-reliant ethos. It is an individualist ethos. It is the ethos of someone who has looked at what the mainstream is offering and decided they do not want it and they do not need it. The Progressive Project, by contrast, requires dependence on government programs, on institutional support structures, on the progressive political coalition's willingness to maintain the transfer systems that funnel resources from earners to its preferred constituencies. Dependence and self-determination are not compatible. The Goth tradition has always chosen self-determination. The regulatory and institutional control dimensions of the progressive agenda are equally relevant. The Goth business owner, the independent record store, the vintage clothing shop, the tattoo parlor, the independent venue that hosts stark music, is not well served by the progressive regulatory agenda that has been building the compliance burden on small independent businesses for decades, while protecting the large institutional players who have the resources to navigate that burden. The progressive governing philosophy regards the independent small business as a unit to be regulated, taxed, and brought into compliance with whatever the current moment's equity and sustainability and labor standard requirements are. Requirements that are designed by and for institutions large enough to absorb their costs, and that fall most heavily on exactly the kind of independent, alternative, non-mainstream economic actors that goth culture has always depended on for its infrastructure. There's also the matter of what the Progressive Project intends to do with the next generation, which this show has covered extensively across multiple episodes. The school system that has been captured by progressive ideology, that is teaching children that their bodies can be changed if their feelings suggest they were born wrong, that is telling children that the institutions around them are fundamentally corrupt, and that resistance to those institutions is the appropriate moral posture, that is converting the classroom from a place of knowledge transmission to a place of ideological formation. That's not a system that produces the kind of independent, self-determined, intellectually courageous individual that goth culture has always celebrated. It produces the opposite. A generation of people who have been formed by institutional ideology to see themselves through the lens of grievance and identity and collective victimhood, who have been taught that their individual feelings are the authoritative guide to their identity and their politics, and who have been given no tools for the kind of dark, honest, individual reckoning with the human condition that great goth art has always required of its practitioners. The goth tradition is not a tradition of victimhood. It's a tradition of witness, of looking at the dark, difficult, uncomfortable reality of the human experience and refusing to flinch from it. That requires the kind of interior strength, a capacity for honest self-examination, and a willingness to exist outside the comfortable fictions that the mainstream offers as consolation. The Progressive Project is a project of comfortable fictions, that the problems of human existence are the product of systemic injustice that can be corrected through the right policies, that the darkness in the human experience is the result of external oppression that can be eliminated if the right people have power, that the individual's interior life is determined by their demographic categories and their relationship to power structures rather than by the particular, irreducible, uncharted mystery of being a conscious human being in a world that contains darkness and beauty in roughly equal measure. If goth culture is about opposing the establishment, about refusing the mainstream's terms, about the principled individual standing apart from the herd and refusing to be managed, then the question of what constitutes the establishment in 2026 is not a trivial one. It's the central question. Because the argument that the goth community member who has aligned with progressive politics is aligning with the establishment, not opposing it, depends on that question being answered clearly. The establishment in 2026 is not the church ladies and the country club Republicans and the conventional bourgeois normalcy that 1979 British goth was reacting against. That establishment still exists, but it doesn't control the institutions that shape public discourse, cultural production, educational content, corporate human resources, social media platforms, or the credentialing bodies of major professions. The establishment that controls those institutions in 2026 is the progressive institutional left. The universities that enforce speech codes and investigate professors for heterodox opinions, The media organizations that have embedded progressive ideology into their editorial standards and call it objectivity. The corporations that have built diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies that enforce ideological compliance in professional settings. The social media platforms that deplatform users for violating community standards defined by the progressive consensus. The entertainment industry that rewards ideological, compliant content and punishes artistic independence. This is the establishment and the actual counterculture, the tradition that says, no, I will not perform your compliance, I will not adopt your language, I will not pretend that your consensus is truth. I will say what I actually think and live how I actually believe, and refuse to be managed by the institutions that want to tell me what the acceptable range of thought and expression and aesthetic choice is. That tradition in 2026 looks a lot more like the people the progressive establishment is trying to cancel than it looks like the people doing the canceling. Johnny Rotten, the actual founding voice of British punk, voted for Trump and explained his reasoning in terms that any Goth who has read the tradition honestly would recognize. I'm not going to be told what to think by people who have decided that their political commitments entitle them to control what I say and who I associate with. That is the punk statement. That is the countercultural statement. That is the statement of the individual who has looked at what the herd is doing and decided that the herd is wrong, regardless of what the cost socially to say so. The faith dimension of this belongs here because this show doesn't leave it out and because it's actually more relevant to the Goth tradition than the progressive left acknowledges. The Gothic tradition, the literary tradition that gave Goth its name, is saturated with Christian imagery, with the theological questions of damnation and redemption and the nature of the soul, with the specific darkness that comes from taking seriously the possibility that there is a moral order to the universe and that human beings consistently violate it. Frankenstein is a story about creation that exceeds the creator's wisdom, a fundamentally theological question. Dracula is a story about the supernatural, undead, that requires a Christian framework of consecrated earth and holy water and the cross to make sense. Poe's obsession with guilt and damnation and the inescapability of conscience is the obsession of someone who takes the moral architecture of the universe seriously, even when, especially when, that architecture produces terror rather than comfort. The progressive left has no theology. It has politics in the place where theology used to be. The same totalizing claim to explain the human condition. The same demand for confession of sin, privilege, and performance of penance, allyship. The same hearsay trials for those who deviate from orthodoxy, the same institutional apparatus for enforcing compliance and punishing dissent. But it has no transcendence. It has no darkness that is not the product of systemic injustice and therefore correctable through the right policies. It has no accounting for the particular irreducible darkness that the Goth tradition has always known lives inside every human being, not as the product of oppression, not as the result of demographic disadvantage, but as the fundamental condition of consciousness in a fallen world. The person who takes the Goth tradition seriously, who has read the books and listened to the music and lived in the aesthetic and actually inhabited the intellectual tradition, rather than just wearing the clothes. That person knows that the darkness is not a policy problem. It's a human condition. It can't be legislated away. It can't be deconstructed into a power structure analysis. It can't be resolved by the right progressive coalition winning the next election. It has to be faced, acknowledged, and somehow survived, which is exactly what the Goth tradition, at its best, has always been about teaching people to do. The left will not help you with that. It does not have the tools. It does not acknowledge the darkness that cannot be blamed on external oppression. It does not make the space for the individual who looks at the human condition honestly and finds it irreducibly complicated, morally ambiguous, and lit from below by something older and stranger than any political consensus. The conservative tradition, the tradition that takes seriously the fallenness of human nature, the necessity of moral structure, the wisdom accumulated in institutions older than any political movement, the particular dignity of the individual soul. That tradition has more in common with what the Goth literary and artistic heritage actually is than the progressive project that has tried to colonize the aesthetic. In 1979, Susie Sue walked onto a stage and refused the mainstream's terms. In the same year, Ian Curtis recorded Unknown Pleasures, an album whose iconic cover, the radio wave pulsar image, became one of the most reproduced images in alternative culture history, printed on more t-shirts than almost anything else in the subculture's visual vocabulary. That album was about alienation, about the gap between interior experience and exterior performance, about the specifically modern condition of feeling disconnected from a social world that demands a performance of normalcy you cannot sustain. It was honest in a way that the mainstream was not. It was dark in a way the mainstream was not permitted to be. And it built a community of people who recognized themselves in that honesty, who had been performing the required normalcy and felt the strain of it, and found in the music and the aesthetic and the subculture a space where the performance was not required. The left that wants that community's votes does not offer that space. It offers a different performance, a more elaborate, more ideologically demanding performance than the mainstream normalcy the Goth tradition was built to escape. It offers a set of positions you must hold, a set of language you must use, a set of people you must support, and a set you must oppose, and a set of aesthetic and intellectual choices that are acceptable, and a set that will mark you as a deviant. It offers, in short, the exact same thing that the establishment of 1979 offered: conform or be cast out, with different content and far more sophisticated enforcement mechanisms. The person wearing the black clothes and listening to The Cure and reading Poe and calling themselves part of the Goth tradition while policing the language of people who disagree with progressive orthodoxy and celebrating the deplatforming of conservative voices and performing visible ideological compliance for the social media audience, that person is not a rebel. They are a conformist in a costume. They have taken the aesthetic of individualism and put it in the service of the most conformist ideological project in contemporary American life. They are wearing Susie's makeup while doing exactly what Susie's entire career was built to refuse. The actual rebels in 2026 are the people who say out loud, in the current environment, what the establishment does not want said, who use the words the consensus has decided are forbidden, who hold the positions that the institutional power structure has decided are beyond the pale of acceptable expression, who refuse to perform the visible compliance that the progressive establishment demands as the price of social belonging, who look at the cancel culture machinery, the most efficient conformity enforcement mechanism ever built, and say, I know what you are, and I'm not afraid of you. That is the Goth statement. That has always been the Goth statement. The darkness is not something to be managed or corrected or politically resolved. It is something to be faced, honestly, individually, without apology, in the full knowledge that the comfortable world will not thank you for it. Face it. Refuse the conformity. Refuse the performance. Think for yourself, which is the most dangerous and the most counterculture thing anyone can do in the current moment. And do not let the establishment that has colonized the aesthetic of your subculture convince you that compliance is rebellion. It never was. And in 2026, it's still not. Stand with us, support the mission, refuse the silence. Find us at TITDUSA.com and the Stand Against the Silence campaign, and I'll see you next time.